been running this thing called the Asian American Man Study. Started it in the fall of 2015. And for the past 2 years, we've had several hundred men each year. First year, we had like 350 people. This year, we had almost 500 people take essentially it's a Google form of a bunch of questions, but then I do a bunch of sort of data analysis against it. And in some ways, it started like because so much of my life has been in a sort of subconscious way trying to thwart or resist Asian stereotypes. It sort of like came my interest in and sort of talking about race or thinking about race came much later in life too, because I was a gymnast for 16 years, and so I spent a lot of time training and spent a lot of time sort of in like somewhat testosterone laden physical activities, which sort of develops you socially in certain ways and allows you to sort of like deal with more sort of aggressive kinds of interactions, which I think was beneficial. It's not necessarily something I always enjoyed doing, but it sort of allowed me to kind of play up certain characteristics. Obviously, my physical body is a little bit different because of all that gymnastics training, and so I'm naturally kind of extroverted and kind of loud, and so in a lot of ways, I've sort of naturally resisted some of those stereotypes, and so maybe in my own life, I didn't notice as much of how race may have colored conversations or colored interactions or colored things in my life. But in that year, right before that, I started the study, I was hanging out with one of my high school friends, and he's now he lives in San Diego. Actually, we introduced. I don't know if you guys
I
meeting.
remember we hung out. Yeah.
Shen, but he was in New York at the time doing his residency as an anesthesiologist, and he is Chinese American, and he talked about how he's a little bit more quiet, and he was in a relationship with someone who was less extroverted, and so he didn't hang out a ton socially with his classmates, and he was known for being kind of like this strong silent type, which when you get to know him, he's like hilarious and he's goofy and he's not a silent person, but that's just the impression they got of him, and it's sort of reinforced by stereotypes. And he told me this story of how he was working with an attending, and an attending is sort of like the lead doctor in any given situation, but they're also sort of like a new person at a given time. They don't really know you that well, and so they were in a situation where they had to kind of on the fly come up with a new medical or sort of dosage for a certain person, and so he kind of did the conversion on the fly, and he was like, oh, it needs to be blah 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 milliliters. And the attending, who was like a white woman, said, wow, how did you figure that out so quickly? Thank God we have an Asian on our team. And he was just like, it's not because I'm Asian. We aren't like naturally good at math. I can do mental math, but I'd like to be recognized for being able to do mental math. Not that he really cared, but it's just like, why does it have to be about the fact that I'm Asian? So that made me think more, and he encouraged me to write more about this. And I said, I don't feel like I can speak to these things because I have my own experience, just somewhat limited and sort of obviously one type of interaction. And then we've got your experience and talk to some other people, but it's so limited in terms of like, I don't feel comfortable speaking to the broader experience if I only have these sort of like isolated data points. And obviously there's value in a narrative sort of storytelling, like this is just my experience, let me just tell you about my own experience. But I felt like the best thing I could do was get more information. I'm a product manager by day, and so having data to back up any argument is important to me. And so I released this survey the first time. I just put together a couple questions in a Google Doc. I tossed it out to a couple I asked someone from my work who's on the research team to look at it. I knew someone from school who is now in a PhD program looking at race, and I asked him to look at it, and they gave me some tweaks. And so then I just put it out on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter, and I just asked people to take it. And I thought it'd be great if I could get 50 or 100 people to take it, and we ended up getting 300 and something folks taking it, which was amazing, you know. And I think a big part of the reason why people shared it so much was just that they hadn't seen that kind of research being done before. I think for from whatever I can tell, I feel like there's a lot more out there in the sort of world about the experiences of, you know, even Asian women than there are necessarily about Asian men, especially like the deep emotional life or like certain feelings of discrimination or just how race affects them. Obviously, we were also talking a lot about dating because that was something he was thinking about here in, you know, dating in New York, dating in potentially California, and, you know, dating race is often a sort of a big but not always easy to talk about factor when it comes to dating. And so, you know, this, I think a lot of people were interested in it. They wanted to take it. They wanted to know what the study, and I'd never seen anything like this out there. So I was surprised, but also not so surprised at how many people got involved with it.
Yeah, that was really cool. I mean, I think it came about at around the right time as well, you know, and yeah, I mean, I think it resonated with a lot of folks like myself because, you know, one of the things that, you know, the math story is really interesting, right? Because it's the example of this mono minority stereotype, right? Of like, they're not like saying anything negative about you. It's kind of a positive compliment, but it's kind of stereotyping your race, right? It's like, oh, Asians are good at math, or you're really studious, or like you become a doctor, or like you have these respectable jobs. And especially for, say, Asian American men in particular, like, you know, we are not a particularly underrepresented, or, you know, in the grand scheme of things, we are doing pretty well, right, in terms of jobs and professions, you know, representation, technology and science and math and stuff. So, you know, society at large, the kind of more high profile societal research and surveys have been more geared toward women, underrepresented minorities, you know, marginalized groups and such, which rightly so, because, you know, they are facing the kind of more systemic, longer term discrimination. But the thing is, there was a ton of people like yourself and myself and a lot of our peers who grew up, you know, taking honors math classes and going to schools like Stanford and going to medical school and such. And within our jobs, right, within our particular strata in a company or in a university or in a hospital environment, you know, there is still going to be different issues with race and gender at play because, you know, let's say your friend's example is a great example. You're an anesthesiologist, right? You are all doctors in the same hospital. You're all making around the same amount of money. You're all well-educated professionals. But, you know, let's say the assertiveness thing, right? Let's say somebody is not able to feel as comfortable speaking up or speaking their mind. Maybe a bad medical decision gets made because someone is more assertive somewhere else and you don't feel like challenging them, and then some mistake gets made. Whereas, you know, if you were more comfortable speaking your mind, you know, you may come to better consensus or better decisions. So I think, you know, even though I think Asian American males as a demographic, you know, looking at the numbers as a whole in society are doing pretty well. And, you know, there's nothing I can complain about. But I think still, I think there's these issues and dynamics to tease out that are really interesting and that strike a chord with people.
Yeah, and you know, the downside of the model minority is that it sort of almost makes people who don't fit that feel even worse, right? Mm-hmm. So if the expectation is that you should, you know, have a high income, be super well educated, and all these things, and you know, there are significant numbers of the population for Asian Americans who aren't necessarily that, who are, you know, very are in lower income socioeconomic classes, that is almost a double hit, right? It's not only are you, you know, earning lower income or less educated, but you should be even at a higher rate. So what's wrong with you? Sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big issue, right? So both within the micro level, within, say, a school, you know, we both grew up in fairly good suburban schools, and, you know, both within a school, and you're like, I'm the Asian kid in the school, but like, I like, you know, theater, and I like acting, or I like music or sports, and I don't really like school as much, and you feel doubly ostracized. Or also at a macro level, right? So, you know, it's interesting. We can talk about this more generally. You know, what do you define as Asian American, right? So most people, you know, kind of model minority type thinks of East Asian, kind of Japanese, Korean, Chinese American, lighter skinned, you know, maybe from a college educated family. But, you know, Asia is a giant continent. There are who are immigrants here, who are first generation immigrants, who don't have college educations, who are working in kind of very low income jobs, but they are counted as Asian as well, right? So like that goes to your point that people are like, well, why aren't you high achieving and stuff? It's because they are from a lower socioeconomic status. They didn't have any opportunities, but yet they're kind of, because of their race, they have this maybe double stigma.
It's a weird thing to say because how can a race be so generalized when you think about Asia's the largest landmass and population-wise in the world? There's bound to be a huge range of physical, social, cultural, and intellectual differences.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's prompted. I mean, this happened really in the last generation. So our parents, when they came to the U.S., in the 70s, 80s, 90s or so, a lot of them, especially say China and India, I mean, they're the two biggest exporters of kind of high-skilled, highly educated immigrants, right? So a lot of our parents' generation, our parents' friends probably came for college or graduate school or graduate training.
They wouldn't have been able to come here otherwise.
That's right. Because back then, China and India, the doors were so closed that only the 0.1% of the population that was the highest achieving in school or the most accomplished and stuff could come out to be graduate students. And that's why it's no surprise that all these scientists and engineers and business leaders are immigrants or children of immigrants because they came out for graduate school. So it might give this kind of skewed picture in the U.S. of, at least from just Chinese and Indian immigrants, right? That a lot of them are very highly educated and high income because they're the ones who actually came here. But obviously the continent, like you said, is a lot bigger, right? I mean, there's even a larger variation, I would say, there than in, say, North America, right? Because it's such a bigger continent with all these different societies. And there are people coming from different groups. There are refugees from Southeast Asia, from Laos, from Vietnam, from the Philippines, who are coming to escape war. And they're in a very different kind of socioeconomic status or educational status and stuff. So yeah, but in the US, because Asian Americans are not a absolute scale a big proportion, I don't know the numbers, 5% or something of the US population, I don't know the exact numbers. I think for Americans as a whole, they kind of view it as one group. Oh, you're only a few percent population, you must all be kind of the same.
Yeah. So one of the questions we ask is, I consider myself American, and the people who encounter me in day-to-day life consider me American, which is a really fascinating question to kind of compare against. And what you see is
that a yes or no answer?
It's
like
strongly disagree to strongly agree. So you got a 5 sort of like 5-step variable. And so you find that 82% of the men in our study from the 2016 year said they either agree or strongly agree that they consider themselves American. And obviously people born in the United States at a higher rate, it was 88%, and people born in Asia, a little bit lower, 79%, but still, pretty strong sort of, if you live in the United States, you consider yourself American. I mean, that's what a lot of what America says is that it's about what you stand for and what you believe in and what you do, rather than, maybe where you were born necessarily, right? And so that's interesting. But then when you ask people, do you think that people who encounter you in day-to-day life consider you American? Only 61% said agree or strongly agree. So definitely, some differences in response.
That's also self-perception, right? It's, do you perceive that other perceive you, right? You don't have to be
difficult,
people, right?
difficult to suss out,
it's
right?
Interesting that there is this self-perceived, I mean, it's kind of meta, right? It's like, I am perceiving that other people perceive me as foreign. And that might mean something, right? Even if other people don't, it might mean something for my confidence to think that other people look at me as foreign. I mean, that itself is an effect. Yeah.
And you're, in the West Coast. I live in the East Coast. And so we actually did do some geography differences because someone asked about it. This is one of the great things about doing this study over multiple years is you can iterate and make this study better. So I actually took where everyone was living, and then I grouped them into West Coast, which is, California, Portland, the Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii. And then I combined what would be the New England and like whatever it's called, like the Mid-East, right? Which is like Virginia,
Mid-Atlantic.
Yeah, that sort of New York area. And I called that East Coast. I called that the group West Coast. And then I had an everywhere else category. And
I like those categories too. It's actually very funny because that's the most Asian concentration. It's like either West Coast, East Coast, or anywhere else in the 48 states.
I mean, yeah, I like, they talk about the coastal elites or whatever, like it's true that there's a huge, I mean, that's a lot of people, right? And so what we found is the people on the West Coast were most likely to say that everyone else treated them as Americans, so 67%, which is higher than the 61%. Living on the East Coast, 59% said that they felt like people treated them like Americans, and then everywhere else, 48%. So you can see that, like, West Coast really has that strong, and then it just keeps falling down, which it just, I think it makes sense. And then similarly within sub-ethnicities, you found that, East Asians had the highest response rate of feeling like they were accepted versus South Asians were lower, and then or Southeast were lower, and then South Asians were the lowest. So South Asians felt like we're 49%. So it's as if you're South Asian, you feel the same way as everyone does living outside of the two, like, coasts. So, those are some of the what's been difficult is like you get all this great data, and then you could spend forever just cutting it and like looking at it from different lenses, and should we report statistical significance? I don't have that many people. Sometimes we can find significance, sometimes we can't. Should we draw any conclusions from things that are seemingly different, but is it different enough to like say that it's really different, or does it just happen to be a little different? So these are some of the challenges I grapple with right now as I'm kind of getting all the findings together.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, I mean, you maybe talk a little bit about the focus on men in particular, because you can imagine doing an Asian American survey that's the same question. So, the kind of focus on men in particular, that would be interesting.
I think that part of it was just that there's no reason why you couldn't do an Asian one in general, but I think I would, and this is totally sort of like off the cuff, I would imagine that you'd have a lesser turnout from men on that kind of a study. And so I think the calling out men in particular is important to try to draw out those responses, because it's like, this is
because it's
really
targeted, so it feels like this is for me, and maybe the motivation of, you have some motivation as well. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. So what kind of results do you feel are specific to men, or to, at least as you found in your survey, that was interesting, that stood out? Because, the identifies American, you can imagine both genders have similar things.
So some of this gets into things related to dating, right? Have some questions about how, and this could be men and women too, but we have some questions about men are portrayed as, full characters in the media. Men are portrayed at, and sort of like, do you agree, disagree, sort of. So that's let me see if I can grab that one. There was one that was, men are usually represented as attractive, fully developed characters in the media. We had, again, strongly disagree, all the way to agree. And so 69% strongly disagreed, and plus another 25% really is something like 94% of men strongly disagreed or just disagreed with that statement. I think that's, interesting and relevant. Asian men have adequate screen time in the media. Again, you could ask this of Asian people broadly too, but I think there's something there that, similar results on that one, where it's very, high percentage of people. So again, 94% disagreed. And then we get into the sort of dating things, right? I think with dating, one sort of, if I could paint with a broad brush, I think in general, Asian women suffer more from the problem of being exoticized. I think while we've got this sort of exoticized, fetishized side on one hand, sort of generally speaking for Asian women, I think there's this counter narrative that's sort of Asian men. And I'm thinking actually a lot about East Asian men often, although I think this also applies to Southeast and South Asian men as being sort of like lesser attractive in terms of, being potential romantic partners, right? For instance, the example Romeo Must Die, which is a movie with Jet Li and a R&B star named Aaliyah, who has, unfortunately died in an accident, but, she was a beautiful black woman. And this is supposed to be a Romeo and Juliet movie about, warring tribes, the sort of like Asian triads, and then the sort of black gang are fighting. And, he's dating Aaliyah. And sort of at the very end, they were, I think they shot a version where they kiss. And then that didn't pan well with audiences. And so they sort of embrace at the end, but they don't even kiss, which seems like sort of, even if this is supposed to be mainly an action movie, it seems sort of weird that you wouldn't have the two leads that are supposedly in love demonstrate any kind of physical affection.
Right. And it's like in every other movie, even like a low-grade movie that happens, right? It's like in every other
even
movie,
when it's unnecessary.
Not surprising.
Right, in any way, the characters will fall in love or have sex, and it's just like that. What was that even necessary? But there's no problem showing it, and so that's sort of an anecdotal reason or example. But I'll sort of like pull up here. I have a couple questions related to this. So one of them was, how often has someone said, "I don't date Asian men" in your presence? Because my friend, brought this up, that's something that he's heard, right? Either as a direct rejection if he's, looking to talk to somebody, or as just something someone casually said in a conversation, maybe not at him, but in his presence, where it's like, it's a fairly rude thing to say, and probably inappropriate under most settings. And so about 74% of all men have heard at least once in their presence someone say, like,
wow,
"I don't date Asian men," or sorry, 64%. So I'm including 0 times, and then people who said, "I'm not sure," so I didn't include those. But of those, of the 100% pie, 20% have heard it 6 or more times. So not just like once, in passing. And so, again, that's something that I don't think I think would be less applicable to unlikely to come up as frequently with a study that included Asian women.
Right. And or also of other races and ethnicities as well, right? So this is an interesting point that you hit on, because let's say this, again, very broad brush stereotyping. If Asian men are viewed as less assertive or less, present in, say, the media as dominant figures or as stars and stuff, then maybe people will feel it may be more okay to say these sorts of things casually, right? So imagine, it's interesting. So in the US, right, like there are things that are very politically incorrect to say about ethnicities and races. And like, people might think that, but, you would get in trouble if you say certain things that are derogatory about certain races or types of people. But this kind of flippant statement like, "Oh, I don't date Asian men," or "Oh, I wouldn't find Asian men attractive,"
right.
Maybe people are less likely to think that that's politically incorrect because Asian men are not as represented in the media or in politics or in positions of leadership and stuff. I think that actually these sorts of micro statements actually get to a bigger point. Yeah. So I think that actually is pretty significant.
Yeah. And, I think one example is you talked about representation in the media. And so, I asked this question, who is the Asian American man you admire most and why? And so it's not everybody answered this. And so, about a quarter of people just skipped this question. But then of the people who answered it, the number one person that was stated was Bruce Lee, who has been dead for 47 years at this point, almost 50 years. Or he died in like 73.
Wow.
So he's been dead for, a really long time. And he is still, the number one person. And then after that was Aziz Ansari, who less than half as popular, Jeremy Lin, John Cho. So, we got to some people who were living, but, and then a lot of people did say, like, I don't know, or, actually, at first I was really upset by this, that, like, roughly the same number of people, maybe even slightly more than named Bruce Lee, said, I don't know, or I can't think of anyone. But I did check the Gallup poll, because Gallup does their own, like, most admired man or woman. And, a reasonable percentage of people also say, I don't know, although it's typically, it's almost never higher than the first named person.
Right. Yeah, this has to do with, I mean, the media thing. It really has to do with her, because it's like, if kids grow up watching the media, right, both on TV and in movies and now on the internet, we can't help but just see faces everywhere, right? And if there are no Asian American male figures or role models that are portrayed positively or even get screen time, like you said, then kids just grow up feeling, oh, that's not something I could do, or that's, and this happens not just with Asian Americans, right, with many ethnicities and races. That's why representation is important. Having role models in any field, in the media or in sports or in academics and stuff. Yeah, I think that's a real issue, because it is
really
subconscious.
Interesting to study role models, and role models based on gender and based on race. My partner Amanda PG-Podcast is doing this campaign right now on Kickstarter, where she's it's called Beyond Curie, and that's for Marie Curie, who I didn't even know this, won the Nobel Prize twice, actually. And so she's one of the few people who've actually won it twice, like, of any gender. But there's 16 other women who have won Nobel Prizes in STEM fields, but most people don't know any of them.
Right.
And then there are plenty of others who have made major contributions, but for whatever reason weren't named. And so she's been doing these collages of each day featuring one woman in sort of like a beautiful way. She highlighted Katherine Johnson, who's the star of Hidden Figures, that sort of drama documentary. I don't know what you call that, but sort of based on true life story of this Black woman working in NASA. There are actually several. And it's done really well on Kickstarter. She had sort of a minimum of $1,000 for selling these posters and prints, and she's at this point done over $15,000 in terms of sales and pre-orders. And people are really excited. Teachers are buying this for their classrooms, so they're asking to buy the whole set. Nice. Like, I want a pack of all 32. And I think a big part of it is just, right, it's not just theoretically someone understands that they could be a scientist even if they only see male people, but sort of, psychologically, it's different. And so I'd love to see some, I know one study that I believe this is, I don't know if I can find the link right offhand, but it was like when President Obama was elected president and during the actual inauguration period, or during his reelection, I can't remember what, but like African-American men, either in some kind of IQ test or SAT test, their scores were basically on par. They were not, typically there is a statistically significant difference. And during that like 1 week period, the scores were normalized, which if that's true, like, that's unreal, like, that's like the power of stereotype threat. That's like sort of when stereotype threat is actually lifted, right? And so I'd love to see more studies on that, because I think it would be great to talk about why representation matters from a sort of a very empirically driven approach.
Right, and how it has a bigger effect on society, right, as a whole. I mean, these things could have a really big effect. I mean, the media stuff's interesting because it seems kind of superficial, like, oh yeah, like, who cares who's on the show on TV, or who's in this movie, or who's featured in this ad somewhere for, for makeup or for clothes. But if you see it again and again, and that just kind of goes, it really drills into your psyche over
it's interesting
these
because
years.
There's I think there's just so much that what is default and then what is different from the default, and I think that's those are challenges that I think when the default goes to, so there's a documentary that MTV did called White People, a documentary, and it's Jose Vargas. I can't remember his full name, but he's this journalist, and he's also an undocumented immigrant from the Philippines, but he has like a Spanish sounding name. And he goes to all these college campuses and high school campuses, and he asks, white people, it's like, what is it like to be you? And it's sort of interesting. Like they follow this one kid who grew up in the South but goes to a historically black college, and he has his like high school friends meet his college friends. There's a guy who teaches a white privilege class in college, and he has his parents who are pretty conservative come to his white privilege class. And it's fascinating, right? To think about the putting that lens in another direction too, and sort of how rarely it's done because it's the assumed default, right? The fact that there's a documentary about white people is sort of odd and rare because so much of the conversation about race is other races.
Yeah, right? And it's interesting too because what is quote unquote white is huge, right? I mean, there are 1 billion, 100 millions of people who identify as quote unquote white in the US, but they come from all different backgrounds, and we have all these heterogeneity issues. And the one thing I thought of here was that this normalcy thing is interesting, right? That you can imagine 100 years ago, if you were redheaded and had freckles and from Ireland, an immigrant from Ireland, you wouldn't be viewed as white because the Protestants who were here, 100 years before were white, and you were some weird foreigner with red hair and freckles. And right. Now, I think with more people mixing and more mixed race children growing up, I see this difference now. I mean, I'm optimistic that if you look at, billboards and you look at TV shows, there are a bit more biracial or multiracial people, or people who you think, oh, maybe they could be Asian or Hispanic, but like, I can't really tell. And right. Maybe that's perhaps one segue into the future that, someone who looks stereotypically Indian or stereotypically Chinese may not be a leading figure in the media, but these people who are mixed race, half white, half Asian, half white, half, they might be the ones who can kind of push more toward the mainstream because they look more kind of quote unquote white. So I think that could go in that direction.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And, in general, I'm just a huge fan of TV shows that show people in different situations. Like there's this one show called The Good Place with Kristen Bell, and she's sort of landed in heaven, and there's this supporting character who is supposedly a Buddhist monk who's taken a vow of silence, but he's really like a DJ who like accidentally got into heaven somehow, and he's like just like freaking out, but he's like kind of a dunce. He's sort of like a doofus and like comedic relief, but like in a way that's wonderful that an East Asian guy is not right. The nerd. He's kind of a little bro-y, and he's just a little dumb, and I'm like, hey, we need that, like it's great to have that. It's great to have this as a separate group. There's this show called The Expanse that is sort of 200 years in the future, and the captain of the ship is a South Asian man who has a Southern accent, and that's right, rare. Right. But he's kind of like a cowboy figure, and I'm like, I love this. I love that he's got this accent. It surprised me at first, but now it's like totally normal. I mean, it's like, no one's from the South. I mean, they're all in space.
Yeah, exactly. That's funny because I actually grew up in Louisiana, and Aziz grew up in, I think, South Carolina, right?
Yeah.
And we grew up talking with a Southern accent because that's the people you're around, right? So it's not right. Not that weird because kids grow up with whatever accents are around, but it is weird because you are of a different race. So we got to wrap up pretty fast. I really like this topic. I mean, we could talk about this forever, but what do you think? I guess the closing kind of thoughts for you in terms of what would you think is your ideal in terms of actionability for this survey? Right? I mean, what would you like to see happen, or the next steps that, if you had all the resources in the world and all the cloud in the world, what would you want the result of the survey to?
Yeah. So all the cloud in the world, I mean, I think first off, I want to finish sort of like crunching all these numbers. And then two, I want to start writing a series of articles or pitching articles for other publications that are sort of like segmenting on the media thing or on the stereotype thing or on the dating thing, and kind of like getting conversations going about a variety of these topics and getting Asian men themselves to talk about these topics. I would love to do sort of some interesting like in-person activities like meetups with other Asian men. Not that, Asian men don't meet up regularly otherwise.
Right, but to discuss these topics more.
Yeah, more of a forum for that. And yeah, I'm not sure what else, potentially a seminar series encouraging parents of Asian children to put their kids into politics, business, and acting or singing as viable business future careers.
Lower expected income and higher risk.
Yeah, lower expected income, but potential for explosive, success. I
Right.
mean, Randall Park, from fresh off the boat, he didn't really start getting stuff until I think he was like 39, and he was saying he's Korean, and he's like, yeah, my parents basically written me off. They're
Yeah.
just like, yeah.
Well, I mean,
What
yeah, I
are
mean,
you
all actors and actresses have this problem, but it is that,
right.
it is even more exacerbated when your parents are expecting you to have a graduate degree and be a doctor or something.
Right. So, but it's important. Just like it's important for societies to have entrepreneurs and adventurers who fail their companies or who, die trying to find something new and don't succeed. Like we have to heroize that a little bit. I think similarly, it's like it's good for everybody if this happens, even if it means that some people might not succeed in this endeavor. Like the overall expected outcome for the group is positive.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the pendulum needs to swing a bit toward that side.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Thanks, Jason. We'll go offline for a bit, but thanks again.